The chandeliers above glittered like captured stars, their light spilling over marble floors. It was polished to a mere shine and reflecting the swirl of gowns and tuxedos in a kaleidoscope of wealth and privilege. Laughter and music floated through the grand ballroom, blending with the clink of crystal glasses and the soft notes of the live orchestra in the corner. Yet for all the grandeur, all the attention, she could not shake the awareness that she did not belong. Her pale blue gown, though elegant, was a far cry from the shimmering designer creations worn by the other women tonight. Hers, simple, modest, chosen carefully to be respectful without being ostentatious. Because she had no intention of drawing attention to herself, her hair was swept into a soft chignon. Her only jewelry, a delicate silver necklace. Her late mother had given her before she passed away. It was all she had of her, and wearing it felt like a shield. A reminder that she was more than just the title she carried now, Mrs. Ethan Blake in name, but not in truth. Their marriage had not been born of romance or affection. It was an arrangement in exchange forged in the offices of lawyers and signed on paper without a whisper of love. Her father's company had been drowning in debt after his sudden death. She had been left with little choice when Ethan Blake, the cold and calculating CEO of the most powerful conglomerate in the city, offered a solution: marry him for 2 years, and in return he would save the company from collapse. She had agreed, knowing full well what it meant. He had been clear from the start: there would be no shared life, no expectations of affection, no entanglement of hearts. They would play their parts in public and live separate lives in private. It was nothing more than a mutually beneficial business decision, a deal between two people who needed something from each other, and nothing more. Ethan was a man carved from ice, tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of unshakable control, every movement precise, every word deliberate. His gray eyes could be as cold as steel or as sharp as glass, and tonight they were both. He was the center of the room, as always, greeting dignitaries, shaking hands with politicians charming, investors with that smooth, confident voice that could sway an entire boardroom. Yet to her he was a stranger, standing only a few feet away, and still feeling impossibly distant. She stood near the edge of the room, sipping at a glass of water, the stem trembling slightly in her fingers, not because she was nervous of crowds, but because being here meant being reminded of the gulf between their worlds. She kept her expression calm, poised the way she had learned in the last 6 months since the wedding, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She did not expect him to notice her presence tonight, and he did not until later. She thought she was invisible until the moment she heard a warm, deep voice behind her, one that carried both charm. In a subtle undercurrent of interest, she turned and found herself face to face with Adrian Carter. His reputation preceded him, a rival CEO in the industry, younger than Ethan by a few years, but just as ruthless in business, though far more approachable. In demeanor, he had dark eyes that seemed to drink her in, a smile that was both disarming and dangerous, and a way of looking at her that made her feel seen in a way she had not in months. Mrs. Blake, he greeted with a faint tilt of his head, and before she could respond, he reached for her hand, lifting it slightly as his thumb brushed against her knuckles, the gesture light yet charged. "You look stunning tonight," he said, and for a moment she felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wanted to pull her hand back, but something in the way he spoke held her in place. She was not used to this, to a man looking at her as if she were more than a name on a contract, more than a prop in a business arrangement. She managed to thank him politely, her voice steady, though her heart was not. But before she could say more, the atmosphere shifted. It was not a sound or a movement exactly, but something she felt: a ripple in the air, a tightening of the space around her. And then his presence filled her senses. Ethan had moved across the room without her noticing, silent as a shadow, and now he stood beside her, his height and broad frame casting a quiet dominance that made Adrian's smile falter ever so slightly. Ethan's gaze was not on her, but on the man still holding her hand, gray eyes locked in a silent clash with dark ones. His voice, when it came, was calm, low, and edged with something sharp. "She is needed elsewhere, Adrian," Ethan said, using her first name in a way that sounded possessive, not casual, and certainly not businesslike. She blinked at the word wife, because he so rarely used it even in public. Adrian's grip on her hand loosened, but not immediately. Instead, he met Ethan's eyes with a polite smile, one that did not reach his gaze. "Of course," he said, but the undercurrent was clear. This was not the last time they would speak. Ethan's hand closed around her wrist. Firm, not painful, but impossible to ignore, as he guided her away from the crowd, his touch searing against her skin. In a way that made her breath catch, she stumbled slightly to keep up with his long, purposeful strides. Past clusters of guests who glanced curiously at the sight of the untouchable, Ethan Blake personally escorting his wife from the ballroom, they stepped through tall glass doors onto the terrace. The city sprawled below in a sea of twinkling lights. The night air cool and carrying the faint hum of distant traffic. She pulled her hand free, turning to face him with confusion and a spark of irritation. "What was that about?" she asked, her voice low, but taut with demand. His jaw tightened, his gaze sweeping her face as if weighing whether to answer. "Adrian is trouble," he said finally. "You should stay away from him." Her brows drew together, and she asked why it mattered. Their marriage was nothing more than a contract. Wasn't it? Something flickered in his expression, then gone almost before she could catch it. Something like a flash of heat and maybe even hurt. He stepped closer, erasing the space between them until she could feel the steady rhythm of his breath, his voice. "Dropped lower contracts have boundaries," he said, "and you are mine within those boundaries." Her pulse jumped at the weight in his words, and though she told herself it was absurd, she could not stop the warmth blooming in her chest. "You sound jealous," she challenged softly, her eyes searching his. His gaze dipped briefly to her lips, and for a heartbeat. The air between them thickened, charged with something she had never felt from him before, but then he straightened, as if pulling back from an invisible edge. Shoving his hands into his pockets as he turned away without another word, he walked back inside, leaving her alone on the terrace, her heart pounding. In confusion, her mind spinning with the way his voice had wrapped around that single word, mine, and the strange, dangerous truth that she was no longer sure if she wanted it to mean nothing at all. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of their penthouse, painting golden streaks across the polished floors, and the distant hum of the city below was the only sound in the otherwise silent living room. She stood at the kitchen counter, pouring herself a cup of coffee, her thoughts still tangled with the events of the previous night. She had hardly slept, replaying the moment on the terrace over and over in her mind, wondering what had really been behind Ethan's sudden possessiveness. The sound of footsteps drew her attention, and she turned to see him entering, dressed immaculately as always in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes lingered on her for just a moment longer than usual before he walked past without a word. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself to focus on her own day. She had agreed to accompany a few colleagues from the charity. She volunteered it to a luncheon downtown, an event completely unrelated to Ethan's business, yet she could not shake the sense that his gaze followed her even after she left hours later. She arrived at the luncheon. The warm chatter of the small gathering, a welcome change from the formality of the night before, and it was there that Adrian appeared again, as if fate had a strange sense of humor. He greeted her with the same confident charm as before, taking the seat beside hers and asking how she had been, his tone light, but his eyes searching as though trying to read the unspoken parts of her answer. She tried to remain polite, maintaining the careful boundaries she knew were necessary. But when he leaned closer during a conversation about the charity's upcoming fundraiser, his hand brushing lightly against hers, she felt an uneasy awareness that someone was watching, and when she glanced toward the doorway, her breath caught. Ethan stood there, tall and unmovable, his expression a storm barely contained. The moment their eyes met, she felt a shiver run through her, not of fear, but of something deeper, something she could not yet name. He crossed the room without hesitation, his gaze locked on Adrian, who now leaned back in his chair with an almost defiant ease. Ethan spoke to her first, his voice low and measured, saying that they needed to talk, his hand resting lightly yet firmly on her shoulder, as though making it clear to everyone in the room exactly who she belonged to. Adrian rose, slowly offering a polite smile to Ethan, though there was a flicker of challenge in his eyes. "Always a pleasure to see you, Blake," he said, but Ethan did not return the sentiment. Instead, he simply guided her away, his grip steady on her arm. As they left the luncheon, she waited until they were outside. Before pulling free and demanding to know what his problem was, you agreed this marriage was just a contract, she reminded him. So why does it matter who? Speak to. His jaw tightened, his voice lower now, almost a growl, because he is using you too. Get to me, he said, and I will not allow it. She crossed her arms, searching his face for the truth, but all she found was the heat in his eyes. The same heat she had seen on the terrace, and though she wanted to argue, her voice faltered because deep down she knew it was not just about business that night at home. The tension between them lingered heavy in the air every time. She walked past him in the living room. She felt his gaze following her, and when she finally turned to ask if he was going to keep glaring at her all night, he rose from his chair in one fluid motion, closing the space between them until her back nearly touched the wall, his hands braced on either side of her, his voice low and rough. You think I do not care because I told you I would not, but every time I see him near you, I want to tear him away from you. His confession sent a rush of warmth and confusion through her. She searched his eyes for any hint of mockery, finding only truth. His gaze dropped too. Her lips again, but this time he did not pull back. Instead, he closed the distance, his mouth capturing hers in a kiss that was both fierce and unyielding, stealing her breath and leaving her clinging to the front of his shirt for balance. When he finally drew back, his breath was ragged, his eyes burning with something that left her dizzy. He said that she was his, and he did not care what the contract said because some things could not be written in ink. The days that followed blurred into a strange new rhythm. He was still Ethan, the controlled, calculating CEO in public, but in private there was a change, a quiet claim in the way his hand rested on the small of her back, a heat in the way his gaze lingered when she walked into her room. And though they did not speak of it, the air between them was charged. Then came the night of the charity gala, the final event before the fundraiser. Adrian was there, of course, watching her from across the room with the same interest he had shown from the start, and she felt Ethan's presence before she even saw him, his hand sliding around her waist in full view of everyone as he leaned close to whisper in her ear, asking if she was enjoying herself. She barely had time to answer before Adrian approached with a glass of champagne, offering it to her with a knowing smile and saying he hoped to have a dance before the night ended. Ethan's response was instant, his arm tightening around her, his voice smooth but edged with warning. I am afraid my wife is already taken for the evening. Adrian's smile sharpened, as if enjoying the challenge, and for a moment she feared the tension might snap, but instead, Ethan simply guided her onto the dance floor, holding her close and away. That left no doubt to anyone watching that she was his. As they moved to the slow music, she dared to look up at him and saw the truth laid bare in his eyes. There was no cold distance now, only a fierce possessiveness and something warmer beneath. It's something dangerously close to love, and though neither of them spoke, the realization settled between them like a silent vow, one that no contract could ever contain.